Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today on the Gold Silver Bitcoin Show, brought to you by the GoldSilverBitcoin.com store. We are more than honored to be sitting down today with Norm Pattis, a leading American trial lawyer. He's a veteran of well over 150 jury trials and scores of appeals, resulting in acquittals for people charged with major felonies and multi-million-dollar civil rights jury verdicts. He's a regular in the national media, from the New York Times to the Today Show. Norm is a frequent speaker, twice best-selling author labeled America's fiercest trial lawyer. He's a prolific blogger and the host of Pattis on Justice. He represents people such as folk hero Alex Jones. Thank you so much, Norm, for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. I know I was supposed to be here last week, but I spaced out, so I'm glad you're patient. Thank you.
It's our pleasure. Thank you so much. Now, Norm, you represent people who face powerful foes. You're a lawyer who believes in the Bill of Rights. Can you kind of speak a little bit more about the importance of the Bill of Rights and how it applies to your work?
Sure. I mean, the Bill of Rights are the first 10 amendments to the United States Constitution. And at the time the Constitution was drafted, some people thought, hey, wait, we have a limited government. If we specify those things that are off reach to government, government will take everything else. But, the debate went back and forth. We enacted them. Basically, I believe that the most terrifying force in the world is a self-righteous mob. And so I'm a criminal defense lawyer and a civil rights lawyer, and our firm stands next to the accused or little people fighting government, because the Bill of Rights respects the sanctity, autonomy, and privacy of individuals. That's my lodestar. That's my firm's lodestar.
You talk about the process of learning about the Bill of Rights, the Constitution, and kind of, I guess, the epiphanies that you had during the course of your studies and why you think they're so important.
Well, I don't know about epiphanies. So, like most of us, you tumble out of the womb and into a world you scarcely understand, and then stuff happens and you're in school, and some things attract your attention and others don't. So I remember in high school having a civics teacher require us to memorize the preamble, which which I've since forgotten, but I remember most of it, and it enshrines the principle of limited government. We the people, for the sake of domestic tranquility, we create a government. And then in college, I remember reading Locke's second treatise on government and the notion of a state of nature and the creation of government to assure limited ends, and the notion that the people retain the right to resist and that government remains accountable to people. So we as individuals have created government. We had rights prior to and pre-existing to the existence of government, and our rights aren't given us from the government. We rather yield certain liberties to the government in exchange for security and the benefits of living together under the rule of law. So, I didn't go to law school initially. I thought I wanted to teach political philosophy. I taught at Columbia for a while. Hated teaching, decided I wanted to know how the real world worked. And when I went to law school, I was massively disappointed. I thought the excitement of Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, and the 17th, 18th century social contract theorists, David Hume and others, they were dynamite. They were liquid gold in my hands. The law, on the other hand, can be kind of dry, overbearing, and uninteresting. So the challenge in my legal career for the past 30 years has been to try to breathe the life of classic philosophic texts into the law. And that remains my challenge and preoccupation.
Of those texts, which stood out to you that you recall today the most? Which thinkers or which texts?
Well, of those texts, the ones I mentioned, Locke's second treatise remains vital to me. In fact, I'm rereading it now and writing periodic comments on it on my blog page, which I don't visit all that often. But the Locke's second treatise, I think you'll see reference to it in Supreme Court decisions. I think the other two works I think that influenced me the most were obviously the Bible. I mean, it's an unparalleled story of God's regard for individual humanity and collective humanity. And then Augustine's Confessions, which remains in my mind the most compelling account of grace and what it is to be open to life's possibilities in a terrifying world.
What do you think people are unaware of today, generally speaking, in terms of these early political philosophers or Enlightenment thinkers as well? What do people get wrong?
Well, I'm not sure people are reading them anymore. I mean, you make an allusion or a reference to a biblical story or parable, and people will look at you and say, where's that come from? If you walk into a bar and say, oh, for all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, people are going to look at you and say, order another one, pal. But there it is in the good book. So I don't think people read enough. I think in a digital era, we've become lazy and books have become artifacts rather than necessary tools. My wife and I own a bookstore. Books are my best friend. I think people should read. Reading is fundamental.
I'm looking at the first treatise and the second treatise by Locke, and we see that according to Wikipedia, at least, the first treatise is focused on the refutation of Sir Robert Filmer, in particular his Patriarcha, which argued that civil society was founded on a divinely sanctioned patriarchalism. Locke proceeds through Filmer's arguments, contesting his proofs from scripture and ridiculing them as senseless, until concluding that no government can be justified by an appeal to the divine right of kings. The second treatise outlines a theory of civil society. Locke begins by describing the state of nature, a picture much more stable than Thomas Hobbes' state of, quote, war of every man against every man, and argues that all men are created equal in the state of nature by God. From this, he goes on to explain the hypothetical rise of property and civilization, in the process explaining that the only legitimate governments are those that have the consent of the people. Therefore, any government that rules without the consent of the people can, in theory, be overthrown. As you're reading this the second time through, does it bring to mind anything that stood out the first time, or is there anything new that you're getting out of this text?
Well, so I just listened, obviously, and I don't want to say it's the second, after, it's probably the 15th time I taught it and read it and reread it repeatedly when I was a kid, looking in it for guidance in a world that I thought was chaotic. I grew up in Detroit amid circumstances that were somewhat dire and bleak. First kid in my family to graduate high school, much less go on to college and beyond. But let's talk about what you just read. So just at the turn of the 17th century, James I of England wrote a book on the divine right of kings. There was a legitimacy crisis in England, much as there is in the United States now. Public institutions didn't have the support of the people. And so James I and the Catholic Church and high Anglicans, and basically just about everybody in England, thought that God was in control. God created the universe. And as you see in St. Paul's letter to the Romans, chapters 13, 1 through 4, there's a notion that government was created for the good of the people, and that you should obey a government as divinely ordained. James I took that a little farther and said, if government comes from God and I am government, well, then I've got God's powers. I'm an absolutist, and I can do pretty much whatever I like, and you ought to obey. The English Civil Wars, which were fought in the 1640s and resulted in the beheading of Charles I, challenged the divine right of kings. And Locke wrote thereafter about a different theory of legitimacy. Rather than power flowing top down, it flowed bottom up. Robert Filmer wrote a famous book called Patriarcha, trying to trace political authority all the way back to the book of Genesis. And there is this group of biblical fundamentalists who to this day think the world is only, 4,400 years old, and they've got theories that are based on the Bible as a proof text, the Bible being taken as inerrant, right in every respect. I don't think most of us go quite that far. We look at it as certainly inspired and as something fundamental or something that anchors us in the world, or at least we used to. Locke criticized Filmer and I think destroyed his reasoning in much the same way that Clarence Darrow destroyed the reasoning of William Jennings Bryant in the Scopes monkey trial in the 1920s in Tennessee. In the second treatise, however, he came up with a different theory of government. And that theory of government was the notion that we initially lived in a state of nature, and a nation in an era without a society, without government, and we created society and government on the basis of agreements, on the basis of contract, and thus government. We are governed by our consent. Now, the state of nature is an anthropological fiction. It takes a village to create a child. And one of the great chicken and the egg stories in philosophic anthropology is what came first, the individual or the group? And, who knows? You take your pick and you choose a perspective and you develop premises and arguments follow. I like the state of nature as a thing that says, don't assume that government is eternal and inevitable. Locke talks about an appeal to heaven. that the people always have a right to resist, but you better win when you make that appeal to heaven, because the sovereign doesn't give up without a fight. So I think here in 21st century America, there's open talk. I saw it this week in the press. Are we on the cusp of a civil war? Well, the answer is maybe we are. There may be warring or contesting views of legitimacy, or more frightening still, there may just be the lack of a shared sense of legitimacy. And the result of that will be no common agreement about what's right. The Roman orator Cicero once said famously that a commonwealth, or a republica, a res publica, a public thing, is not any old collection of people. He put it more eloquently than that, but it's a people bound together by common interests and a common conception of right. Do we have that anymore? And how are we going to regain it if we don't, and restore it if it's in jeopardy? So, Locke gives you something to think about.
On the state of nature, Locke defines the state of nature thus, quote, "To properly understand political power and trace its origins, we must consider the state that all people are in naturally. That is a state of perfect freedom, of acting and disposing of their own possessions and persons as they think fit within the bounds of the law of nature. People in this state do not have to ask permission to act or depend on the will of others to arrange matters on their behalf. The natural state is also one of equality, in which all power and jurisdiction is reciprocal, and no one has more than another. It is evident that all human beings, as creatures belonging to the same species and rank and born indiscriminately with all the same natural advantages and faculties, are equal amongst themselves. They have no relationship of subordination or subjection, unless God, the Lord and Master of them all, had clearly set one person above another and conferred on him an undoubted right to dominion and sovereignty." Does that bring to mind anything?
Well, I mean, yeah, it does. I mean, these are Locke's philosophic premises, and those are the foundations on which he builds. I think we know that there is no such thing as a state of nature, not one that we can observe. Locke famously said later in the second treatise that in the beginning, the world was North America, as though North America weren't inhabited. Well, it was, and a different group of people came in and took over, and that was violent, and it resulted in the extirpation of certain cultures, aided by smallpox and natural disease. And it's a tragic story that history repeats over and over again. There are winners and losers, as it were. So I think the state of nature is a fiction, and I worry. It might be a necessary fiction in the same way that the state is a necessary fiction. I'm often in criminal court, and I say to jurors at the end, this is the case, state of Connecticut versus Joe Blow. You'll never meet the state. You'll never see the state. And that's because, strictly speaking, the state doesn't exist. We are the state, and individuals act in its name. And your role as a juror is to determine whether you're comfortable with what these people have done in your name. And if you're not, then I don't use the term, but return to the state of nature. Take the power back and rebuke those who act in the name of the state. I worry that individualism, a long tradition of some 3 or 4 centuries in the West, is imperiled, and that as government responds with their perpetual emergency claims arising out of COVID, that we're evolving into what I'll call a critical 4th wave of constitutional law. And I'll describe the first 3 in a minute. But in that 4th wave, a public health state comes to value the imperatives of the group over those of individuals. Thus, we see in New York State, for example, a recent requirement that public health workers get vaccinated unless they have a medical exemption, but the statute or the regulation does not permit a religious exemption. That's a direct insult to the Bill of Rights. I mean, as long ago as Sophocles in the Antigone, we recognize that sometimes the state can require things that individual conscience doesn't permit. And thus in Antigone, Antigone was prohibited to bury her brother who had gone into revolt against the king, Creon. Creon said, "You cannot bury him," which is a sacred ritual for the Greeks. And Antigone said, "There are laws more fundamental, deeper, more deeply rooted than yours, O king, and I will obey them." That's the principle of American government. But I think it's at risk, and here's what's at stake. We're watching the emergence of a federal police power, which will take unparalleled power over our lives if we let it. And we've declared COVID to be a public health emergency. Governors have taken extraordinary police powers. The federal government is trying to exert them. Once COVID is done, someday, I hope soon, not soon enough, we'll have a body of law that gives the government the power to act, federal government and state governments, the power to act in unprecedented ways in the name of the common good. Will then others seek to use it for gun control? Well, yes, we've heard people say that guns are a public health crisis. What about systemic racism? That's also been claimed to be a public health crisis. What about climate change? That's a public health crisis. When everything's a public health crisis, the group gets to decide for the individuals, but it's individuals in the group who are deciding. So Locke's argument remains a powerful limiting principle on the power of governments. We can return to a state of natural liberty. We can assert that government is only legitimate when it is exercising its power and our consent. Now, I mentioned before four waves of constitutional law here. This is just something for your listeners to think about. You know, when the Constitution was framed, we talked about a limited federal government, a government of enumerated powers, and it had very few. I mean, at the time of the founding, there were maybe 40 federal criminal offenses. Now you can't even count them. There are so many. But it was a government of limited powers, and the states reserved police power. This obtained until about the time of the Civil War, and in Reconstruction, the federal government grew a pair. It grew assertive, and under the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, acquired vast power over the states. There was a fight about the scope and bounds of that. During the Depression, the third wave of constitutional reform took place, and we created an administrative state in the form of the Great New Deal agencies that helped address a social crisis, that is mass unemployment. Now there's been some chipping away at that over the years. I think this new fourth wave is a growing intolerance of individual idiosyncrasy, hence cancel culture and all that it wreaks, or evokes rather, and I think it does reek. And I think that the challenge for constitutional lawyers in the next 10, 15 years will be to limit the public health state.
I think there's a misconception that individualism is a form of selfishness. However, I believe that true individuals believe that by empowering the individual, you empower the collective. By allowing individuals to be unique characters, expressing themselves through the lens of their personal experience, we all learn from that. It all makes us stronger. We are a more creative whole. And this is instead equated as a form of selfishness. So that's one of the main critiques I hear about, for instance, not that I consider myself one, libertarianism, which certainly honors the, I guess, supremacy of the individual. And it's considered largely by a certain sect of society as a largely selfish.
Yeah, but but it's always another individual calling someone else selfish. And so if you don't agree with my vision of the good, that makes you selfish. It used to just make you different. And we had limiting principles that honored differences of opinion, and we respected honest debate. Today, we want to get rid of the debate in the name of public safety. And because everything's an emergency, you either agree or you're marginalized. And hence, the lack of legitimacy, the lack of a common conception of good, and in my view, the very real possibility that the United States is evolving into what I will call a failed state.
Much of the world seems to be devolving into numerous failed states, which of course then creates a vacuum for something to come in perhaps larger and say, oh, we're going to fix this.
Well, let's talk about that for a minute, because I think another one of the fundamental challenges in our time will be what to do with artificial intelligence. So recall in 1776, we had not just the Declaration of Independence in this country, but concurrently and coincidentally, unrelated, Adam Smith published The Wealth of Nations. And he argued against mercantilism, the notion that collectives or governments could manage their economies in the name of public welfare in an efficient way. His argument was that when government gets out of the way of individual economic decisions, the collective good is increased because each person seeks their own utility, or what a modern economic theorist might call their own utility function. And goods and services would be distributed across the world in a most efficient manner by means of the invisible hand. And the invisible hand was just a metaphor. It was saying that government's hand is visible, it's a dead weight, it can harm the economy, it reflects parochial and idiosyncratic interests. The invisible hand might unite the world. Well, so now we've got a global economy and talks about globalism and talks about global norms. And we've got global institutions trying to enforce their visions of the good, and you see populists' reactions to them in one place or another. But that I think is the epiphenomena. That's not really what's going on. I think what's going on is big data and the institutions that have access to it are now using AI to make visible the invisible hand, that Adam Smith talked about. And we have, some of us at least, an inchoate, implicit trust in AI to by way of machine learning, distribute goods and services rationally. I'm not so sure I agree with that. I think there's always an algorithm embedded in the machine, and that algorithm reflects biases and it reflects power. Look at the controversy over Facebook right now, and whether Facebook is truly in a neutral fashion, which would be a First Amendment standard, deciding who can speak or who can't, or whether it's reinforcing a certain vision of the good. So I think AI poses a threat. Globalism poses a threat. I would encourage your listeners to do as I've done this summer. I reread a lot of the dystopian classics, 1984, Brave New World, Fahrenheit 451. And in each of them, there was a group that had power, and they had the ability to impose their vision of the good on the rest of us. The protagonist in each side was discontent, was an individual, even in Atwood's Handmaid's Tale. The protagonist was always somebody who wanted a sense of significance. They wanted the ability to decide for themselves. So big data, AI may well make visible a maximally efficient vision of human society in the name of global norms. It could do so, however, without full employment, with leaving and marginalizing permanently some members of the population. I think it's that fear that inspires Antifa, groups like that. But when it does that, it's going to leave a bunch of us feeling discontented, because I don't really want to be fat and happy. I want to be significant, autonomous, and feel fully engaged in my life. And sometimes that's going to mean throwing sand into the computer's face and kicking the screen and turning it off. One of my favorite books I mentioned earlier was Augustine's Confessions. And there's a famous test in the AI community about how we know when computers resemble human intelligence. And in the 1940s, it was called the Turing test. You place a computer and a human behind a screen, and you have the computer communicate with the human. If the human can't tell the difference between the response of the machine or the human, then the machine resembles a human. Here's the new test for AI and AI engineers, and I don't hear anybody talking about it. I'll call it the Augustine test. What makes humans as individuals distinct is a sense of longing for significance. When we can create a machine that longs in the way that Augustine longed for unity with God or for righteousness in the Confessions, then I'll think AI resembles human intelligence. Until we reach that point, AI is a tool, and it's a tool being used to extinguish human liberty, and we need to fight back.
In the dystopian novels, are you seeing any parallels today? What parallels are standing out? What's the dichotomy between the individual and the collective in these books? I know that you've touched on that a little bit, but does anything else come to mind?
Yeah, I mean, I don't watch television news anymore or cable news. I stopped a year or so ago. The only thing I watch on television is college football. So I had the games on Saturday, and I sat down on the couch after exercising on a bike in the living room the other night, and I sat on the controller, and on the screen popped Good Morning America. I haven't seen that forever. And there was this announcer, talking head, breathlessly talking about Gruden's resignation from the NFL because of the shocking speech that he engaged in, words that I can't even utter, and blah, blah, blah. And he went on for about 90 seconds. And his colleagues stood there with him, mourning the fact that this brutal man had hurt everyone's feelings. And oh my God, this is terrible. And the NFL, blah, 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 blah. I thought, what a bunch of garbage. When I turn on the television to watch the NFL, I want to see some skull cracking, and I want to scream at the top of my lung for my team. I don't care if the coach is misogynistic. I don't care if he's racist. I hope he's just like I am, and that is a misanthrope, not trusting anyone to get it right all the time. But the notion that we've got major mainstream media now setting cultural standards based on this soft sense of political correctness strikes me as a form of dystopia. And I think along the coast, the mainstream media, left coast, right, east coast, right coast, there east coast, west coast, you see a homogeneity of views. But in flyover country, you see a certain restiveness and a pushback. I represent, as it turns out, Alex Jones and InfoWars in a series of disputes they're involved in. Millions of people watch Alex Jones. I have a confession to make. When I talk to him, sometimes I have no freaking idea what he's talking about. Globalism, George Soros, this, that, everything else. But I think he's onto something. And I think people miss the significance of folks like Alex Jones by failing to ask the critical question. Why are people attracted to him? They're attracted to him because he's raising questions about a reality that doesn't fit for them. And that reality is coming from Hollywood to New York City. And so I think in the center of the country, there's a big pushback. And it's a pushback against a dystopian, politically correct, unsustainable, unrealistic, and frankly, ridiculous view of humankind. Everybody is significant. Everybody's feelings matter. And we have to go to the wall for every idiosyncrasy, no matter how bizarre. Thus, we argue about who can pee in what bathroom. And I'm thinking, seriously? I mean, in a world of all the problems we have to resort to or solve, potty politics has become something that I have to spend time thinking about, or we have to go to federal court to litigate whether transgender people can identify as a member of the other gender, so that a person born a guy can decide he's a woman and then compete with women who were born women, in high school and or collegiate sports. It's like the bottom has fallen out of pluralism. We've lost any sense of human excellence. And the result is, as we race to the margin, we're racing to the bottom, and we're destroying ourselves and spending the intellectual capital it took centuries to develop. And I'm talking about the intellectual capital that comes from those dead white men, oh gasp, Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, Demosthenes, Augustine, and I could go on and on and on. I was on the campus of Columbia, where I went to graduate school not long ago. And over the library, there is chiseled the names of a bunch of dead white men. The university has seen fit to place a banner over it, atop it, with the names of other authors, many of whom I haven't heard of. And that's a political statement. And the political statement is, what got us here doesn't work. We're going forward into a brave new world. I don't think it's a world many people want to live in. And I think it's going to come crashing down around its ears, because what built the society that sustains us is excellence. And we no longer have a vision of excellence.
I've spent time in the last year and a half in both California and in Idaho. And I think that what really strikes me is that, in fact, the people in so many ways are the sovereign, as Eamon Bundy on this show mentioned, that power does flow from the bottom up. So whereas in California, people were more than happy to go along with measures. At first, it was a lockdown measure. So I experienced in San Diego, California, when one day I woke up and there was caution tape around all of the parks. You weren't allowed on the grass. You were only allowed on the sidewalk in the name of preventing a disease. I didn't really understand if there had been any scientific papers peer reviewed that stated that if there's ever a deadly pandemic, make sure you don't let anyone on the grass. And then there was the masks that actually came in a little bit after the lockdowns, and those were widely accepted. And I think a lot of people, especially in California, did it perhaps because they did think it could mitigate the spread of a virus, but a great number of people also did it because they didn't want to stand out at the grocery store. Yeah. And then when I went to Idaho, however, it was the opposite. So in Idaho, for instance, I believe that the shops generally did lock down for about 2 weeks, but then they opened back up and life got back to normal when I came here in about September. Things were just like in 2019, and the people are much happier here. I think this is a theme that people who are traveling, I work in the Bitcoin industry a lot, and many times people are traveling throughout the country, and everyone is noting how much happier people seem in the countries which did not go into the strict lockdown and then mask, I guess theater comes to mind. And it seems that this is kind of on the coast, as you noted. In fact, I believe California, Washington, and Oregon made an alliance, a Western state, a West Coast states alliance that they would essentially govern in lockstep, I suppose. And then seeing this dichotomy, it was poignant, and it was also very clear to me how much the power does kind of flow from the bottom up.
I think that's right. Tip O'Neill got it right years ago. Politics is local, and we get the government we deserve. So, if you want to live in a PC happy community, go to San Diego or go to New York City and show your card before you go into a restaurant. I simply don't want to be showing cards to go in public places. I think we're a couple steps away from what the Chinese do, which is having social utility scoring. So, in an era of identity politics, aggrieved groups claim privileged position. There's an enormous ground current across the country in smaller municipalities for reparations. And you see some communities actively considering that. That is the decision to pay African Americans some sum of money to make up for historic racial inequity. That feels like a shakedown to me. And so what are we going to end up with? Are we going to end up with a credit card that we use for our purchases as we transfer to a digital economy? And is there going to be a social utility score on it? If you're a member of a privileged group, that is a group that needs to be reparated for historic inequity, are you going to pay 80 cents for the gallon of milk that the white guy pays $1.20 for in order to have a transfer payment rather than a direct tax? Go ahead and say, nah, it'll never happen, but that's what happens in China. Depending on the Communist Party's view of your social health, your acceptability, you may or may not be able to get a seat on an airplane. You may or may not be able to get access to a limited good. When we have groups like Facebook, Twitter, and others making secret decisions about what we can and can't say, that's access to a digital marketplace of ideas that is being denied on ideological grounds. It would be easy to flick that switch and transfer that same technology into the transfer of goods and services. And I predict it will happen. For all I know, it already is happening.
I think I've been bearing witness, and we've been bearing witness to a rewriting of the social contract. Can you speak to that? And I also the significance thereof.
Well, I think people are trying to rewrite the social contract. I was stunned. So March 13th, I got off of an airplane in New Haven, Connecticut. I had come from Austin, Texas. I had $409 in my pocket. The 16th, the economy, I stayed home. I stayed home for about 18 months, had that same $409 in my pocket throughout that whole period, or almost all of that period. I think I gave some to my wife to give a tip to somebody that delivered things to our home. So many of us stayed home. We were told it was too safe to go out. Then George Floyd got in a struggle with police and died and was killed. And the world erupted. And we were told that while we had to stay home and isolate because it was too dangerous to be involved, somehow it wasn't too dangerous for people to take to the streets and engage in mostly peaceful protests in which frequently buildings were burned and businesses destroyed. And then the New York Times began to put its foot on the gas, and in the name of the 1619 Project, began to talk about a so-called racial reckoning going on in the country. I listened to the BBC the other day, a soccer game of all things, and I heard the announcer, as the United States engages in its racial reckoning. And I just turned the radio off. There's no racial reckoning necessary in this country. Slavery was ended by the 13th Amendment shortly after the Civil War. Yes, Jim Crow was oppressive. We had comprehensive federal civil rights legislation imposed before many of your listeners were even born. And we continue to struggle with the impact of race in the United States. But don't let yourself be fooled for an instant. George Floyd was not killed because he was Black. George Floyd was a knucklehead. The police were called to the scene because he passed a counterfeit bill, allegedly. Officers wanted to speak to him. He wouldn't have any of it. They tried to get him to comply. He wouldn't do it. He was complaining that he couldn't breathe when he was sitting upright in the back of the police cruiser. He struggled when he got out of the police cruiser. Officers used the techniques they were trained to use to take him to the ground, and arguably, Chauvin remained on his back, not his neck, on his back too long, and he died. That's not systemic racism. That's a tragic outcome of a guy who didn't have the good sense to say, yes, sir, officer, what can I do for you? I'm innocent, but I'll take my dispute to a courtroom. So the social contract is being restruck, I think, as demographics change. And I think there is a growing recognition on the part of historically disfavored groups that they can seize power. You see this critical race theory being taught in schools, and somehow, we're taught that if you're white, you're not quite right, and that you owe people of color or the disadvantaged something. Newsflash to that percentage of the country that believes that, I don't know a goddamn thing on account of accidents of birth. We owe one another equal respect and regard. And the moment you claim special regard for me on account of your status, you earn my scorn, and that dissolves the republic. So, I think there is an effort to restrike the balance. And I'm not sure where it's going to go without an underlying philosophic foundation rooted in something like Locke or rooted in some alternative philosophy. But I don't see one emerging. What I see is the politics of pathos. the worship of every person who can claim the mantle of victimhood. And as our politics become more and more extreme, the claims of victimhood become more and more ridiculous. In the end, all of us are required to pick up our bed and walk. And the sooner we get back to business and get back to work and restore the economy to vitality, the better off we all will be.
I was raised by a police officer, so I think I have a unique perspective on the stresses of that job, and certainly the very stressful situations in which they find themselves, and whether from a lack of training or otherwise, tragedies do arise. And I don't think, generally speaking, it's because of race. I think many of these police officers are very young. My father was a police officer by the time he was 21 years old. Apparently, your brain's not even fully developed as a male until you're about 25. So I think that what we have are like oftentimes young people who are in difficult situations, who make split second decisions, which, especially with the limelight of media shined on it, can look bad if you maybe lack, I guess, a certain empathy for somebody in uniform. I think there is like this generally kind of um, there is a general distrust of police at the very least. I mean, it wasn't cool that my father was a police officer growing up. I'll tell you that much. And then, so I know that you kind of did watch the Chauvin trial, and you had a message for the jurors. What was that message?
I don't remember, but so you may. But I as a young lawyer, I've been doing this for about 30 years, practicing law now. As I spent the first 10 or 15 years of my career engaged almost exclusively in police misconduct and criminal defense litigation. And I've litigated in front of juries scores of unreasonable force cases, including police death cases. And, I didn't view, other than the last 3 or 4 minutes of the Chauvin apprehension, it looked like a textbook police interaction where I thought the officers should be commended rather than condemned for their patience and their behavior. Now, did Chauvin stay on his back too long? Maybe. But it's not at all uncommon, especially in this media saturated time, for an arrestee to claim, I can't breathe. You're hurting me. Ow, police misconduct. And before you know it, the Twitter mob is there with their iPhones, and everybody's going to take a perspective on it and scare the officer to death. My view is that the Chauvin trial represented a flashpoint in our time and part of the legitimation crisis that we exist in right now. Max Weber, 19th century, early 20th century sociologist, once said, the state is the entity that has a monopoly on the legitimate use of force. We send police officers out as agents of the state to patrol streets in situations that are tense, evolving, and uncertain. And they make split-second decisions. Some of them cost lives of innocent people. Sometimes they make the wrong decision and it costs their own lives. If you look at statistics about police deaths, shooting deaths in the United States, you'll see there's roughly 1,000 a year, year in, year out. The majority of those killed are white men. You stand a higher statistical probability of being shot to death by a police officer if you're a black man, because there are more black arrestees. I don't think that means that police are singling out black people to arrest, but you can argue that that may be a function of systemic racism. I don't think the answer is to defund the police. I don't think the answer is to disband the police. I think if you get that, you get the kind of fires that smoldered in Milwaukee just after Floyd was killed. So I guess my message would be careful what you wish for. You may think you want to return to the state of nature. You may think you want to recast the social contract in the name of your idiosyncratic perception of the good, but don't throw away what it took centuries to create, and that is the sense of settled expectations under law. We have something unique and good in North America. I think we're throwing it away by the fistful.
I was raised on Martin Luther King Jr., judged one by the content of their character, not the color of their skin. He's one of the heroes of this country, as far as I'm concerned. And so I don't feel like I was raised in a innately racist country. I do see, however, that there is this term that is thrown around these days, liberal, and I think there is a modern definition of a liberal, unfortunately, although maybe we could just not use that word as well. And when I look back, I see that there's the classical liberalism, which was based in free markets. It was based in the individual. It was based on God. as the creator. And then there was the social liberalism of the 60s, which cropped up. And increasingly, as we've used this word liberal, I think it's kind of morphed into something that's a little different than it meant under the classical liberal definition, moving more towards some sort of, as Camille Paglia said, Stalinism. Now, let's not go that far. I do see, however, that, for instance, the Dr. Tedros at WHO is a Marxist-Leninist, and I wonder if the philosophy or worldview to which a lot of self-proclaimed liberals subscribe is actually a form of Marxist-Leninism or communism and less liberalism. What are your thoughts on that?
So, I mean, what unites the various thinkers under the Marxist umbrella is a commitment to some form of dialectical materialism. And that is a theory that the world is a product of material clashes, material forces in clash and conflict with one another. And that the proletariat, or at least the communist intelligentsia, in the form of Leninism, can recognize the true shape of these social classes, seize them, and direct the future into forms that benefit us all, the ideal of communism. I think that as our country evolves away from a sense of transcendence, of a rootedness in the Judeo-Christian tradition, a sense that we are accountable to a maker, whether that be God or some other force, and we believe that each of us are sacred in our own right and have the ability to create our own destiny. We're all miniature Marxists. If you think that individuals are no more than the sum of their circumstances, then in true Marxist fashion, you can make better individuals by making better circumstances. And if that means you have to crack a few eggs to make that social omelet, crack those eggs, confiscate wealth, punish the idiosyncratic, silence through cancel culture, the unpopular, in the name of the common good, or in the name of the new emerging public health state. So I think you're right. I think we are undergoing a tyranny of soft Marxism when the hard Marxism failed and lost the Cold War and created living conditions that are largely intolerable in those societies that subscribe to them. And we're almost powerless to stop ourselves because we don't have a counterweight. We've lost a sense of transcendence.
I've heard it put that when the Berlin Wall fell, that it wasn't the victory of capitalism over communism, but rather it was really a melding of these two systems, maybe soft Marxism, as you note, into a third way, is what a thinker Alan Watt has postulated, that these two systems kind of combined at that point. And at that, there was a lot of interesting writings at that point, like Fukuyama, who declared the end of history. So I want to read a quote from Thomas Paine. I think I'm curious about sort of the timeline from the thinkers who you mentioned earlier and the founding of this country and the importance of the founding documents. And Thomas Paine wrote during the time of the revolution, quote, "Society is produced by our wants, and government by wickedness. The former promotes our happiness positively by uniting our affections, the latter negatively by restraining our vices." Can you kind of speak at least to the founding of this country and how it goes back to some of these political philosophers who you've mentioned?
Yeah, well, nobody ever tells you in law school or in civics. I'm not even sure civics are taught anymore. That the Constitutional Convention was one of the great con jobs in American history. At the time prior to the enactment of the Constitution and after the Declaration of Independence, the states banded together in Articles of Confederation that made collective action all but impossible. And after Shays' Whiskey Rebellion in Massachusetts, they got together in Philadelphia with the aim of reforming the Articles of Confederation. They quickly set that task aside. Their mandate was reform. Their mission, however, became revolutionary, and they created something fundamentally new. They created a constitution that exceeded and eradicated the expectations of the Articles of Confederation. But they still maintained a commitment to limited government. And so the claim, I think, was that government was there to act as a restraint on our vices, because all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. But it made possible a better life together. And the purpose of the Bill of Rights was to say to government, you can go this far and no further in the name of our collective good, because we don't trust one another. And I think what the founders had is what we no longer share, I believe. They had a profound suspicion of claims about human perfectibility. In other words, they believed in original sin. Everyone was capable of overreaching. So in the federal government, we have checks and balances. We have 3 branches of government, each of which can limit the power and reach of the other. We further divided governmental power between states and federal government. At the time of the founding, we tipped the balance in the favor of the states. And all of this was because of what Paine said. We succumb to vices, and when left to our own devices, we will do what the Bible warns against. We'll become the pots saying to the potter, why makest me thus? And we'll each demand that the world be recreated in our own image. The founding of limited government and of our constitutional republic was, people will be free to seek their own ends and objectives, but we need government, because if we're too free, we'll destroy one another and ourselves. I think right now we're eliminating those limits, and we're destroying significant parts of our culture.
Going back to the time of the American Revolution, Jonathan Mayhew saw power as of a, quote, grasping, encroaching nature. If at first it meets with no control, it creeps by degrees and quick subdues the whole. And alternatively, power is, quote, like the ocean, not easily admitting limits to be fixed in it. While at other times, power is, quote, like a cancer. It eats faster and faster every hour. Power is, quote, restless, aspiring, and insatiable, and like jaws, always open to devour. So the writers at the time of the revolution saw power as everywhere in public life, threatening, pushing, grasping, and too often, in the end, it destroys its benign victims. Any thoughts on those quotes?
Yeah, that's us. That's sin. Augustine wrote, in addition to the Confessions, he wrote The City of God. And there were those who said that the decline of the Roman Empire was the result of Christians, and that somehow that destroyed an 800-year empire and republic. And Augustine's view is, well, hold on a minute. There are 2 cities. There's the city of man and the city of God. And the city of man is devoted to those claims that we raise as terrestrial beings, where we decide that we know what is good for ourselves and others, and we seek to impose our vision of the good on others. The city of God is people who are bound together by a love of God, and love of the wrong thing, Augustine said, is sin. And so the city of man is a city composed of people who love the wrong thing. They love their vision of the republic, their vision of the good, their class, their race, their identity, their ethnicity, their gender identification, whatever, to the exclusion of what unites us all. That is creaturehood, having been created in the image of God. So I think that the capacity for sin resides in every heart, and power is the ego's transgression of the boundaries separating one from another in the name of equality, and the assertion of the right to decide for others. And I think that's what's at stake in our culture wars right now.
Power was a constant theme in the pre-1776 colonies. As Mayhew wrote, quote, it aims at extending itself and operating according to mere will wherever it meets with no balance, check, control, or opposition of any kind. So, and also actually Newport Mercury, a paper published in July 1764, quote, power is like avarice. Its desire increases by gratification. So I think that there's a lot of interesting it would behoove people to maybe go back and read these quotes. Are from Bernard Bailyn's text, The Ideological Origins of the American Revolution, in which there's actually an interesting, not a chapter, but a note on conspiracy. And it actually highlighted a certain sect of the revolutionaries who, the radical right it was back then too, interestingly, who believed that there was a conspiracy against them of the king. But moving on, I want to talk about kind of your experience representing high profile clients and like what people should know, for instance, about how the media can portray things and the effect that can have. I think about a movie called Arlington Road, and I'm not sure if you've seen it. It's a Jeff Bridges movie, and how not to give it away. So it's essentially like, the truth as the audience of what's happening in this story. However, Jeff Bridges ends up being considered a terrorist because the media is covering things in a certain way, but it's totally just
What's the name of that movie?
Arlington Road.
Oh, I got to watch it. It sounds great.
It is a fantastic film that really, I think, would behoove anyone to watch as a warning for the power of the media to frame a situation and have really everyone just know something that's not true. So can you kind of speak about like just anything people should know about, I mean, you're in high stress situations.
Well, so, people say, what's it like to have a high profile case? And I say, what's a high profile case? Well, case where the media is interested. And I said, well, what makes the media interested? And nobody knows. All cases are the same in a criminal defense lawyer's life. You have a person whose liberty and reputation is at issue, and the state has made allegations against that person. Your challenge is to hold the state to its burden of proof and to represent your client's interests, whether he, quote unquote, did it or not. Because a state that can convict without adhering to the rule of law puts us all at risk. A case, and so at any given point, I may have dozens of cases in my office. We have 5 lawyers here, and most of the world never hears of any of them, frankly, but a significant part of the world hears about 1 or 2 a year. And those are designated high-profile cases, the case that has a bevy of reporters on the courthouse steps or photographers in the courthouse, in the courtroom, and lots of things written about them. I'm always suspicious about those cases and what the public's interest is. So, for example, I'm involved in a case involving a graduate student from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology who's alleged to have murdered a Yale graduate student. And this is a high-profile case. Photographers in the courtroom, the press involved, lots of things written about it. Just today, before talking to you, Good Morning America is called, the Yale Daily News is called, other people have called requesting interviews. And we're not returning these calls, not yet anyhow, because we're new to the case. But what the public needs to realize is that what they're given when a case is presented is one side of the story. That is the arrest warrant. And the arrest warrant is the police officer's best estimate of what happened, untested by cross-examination, unchallenged by the man accused. And it's submitted for public consideration under a de minimis standard of proof, that is probable cause, some reason to believe that the allegations are true and they amount to a crime. In a criminal case, the state has to prove its case beyond a reasonable doubt. That's not 100% certainty, it's something less, and the courts struggle with how to give a definition of what reasonable doubt is. But there are often reasons to doubt the state's assertions. So, for example, in the Yale case, Mr. Pan, the accused, is an Asian man. He stands about 5'10", 5'11". Shots were fired one night. People turned to look, and according to the first eyewitnesses, the shooter was a black man, according to one. Another described him as Hispanic. No one described an Oriental person. Some said there were 2 people present. Some people said there was 1. None of those descriptions are necessarily consistent with Mr. Pan, but yet you read in the paper, Pan was the shooter. Similarly, there's a claim this was a love triangle, that he shot the decedent because the decedent was involved with a woman that he had been involved with. I'm unaware of any evidence, even in the warrant, that supports that hypothesis. Indeed, in the warrant, the woman who was engaged to the decedent told police she was unaware of any interest Pan had in her. Now, they attended MIT together. Maybe there was one, maybe there wasn't. But the media has made up this love triangle narrative, and they're playing now a game of telephone. Somebody reads the warrant, gets it half right under deadline pressure. And by the way, the state of court reporting in the United States is deplorable. As newsrooms have cut their staff, reporters are under increasing pressure to produce more copy with fewer resources, and they're being asked to report on very complicated legal documents like complex warrants. They often get things wrong. But when they get it wrong, it becomes part of the clip file, and that clip file gets repeated by others, and then the public latches onto a narrative that makes sense to them, and the defendant's fair trial rights are abridged. So I think that, or consider another case, the Gabby Petito case, and Brian Laundrie's potential involvement in that. He turns up in her van, she's missing, and everybody concludes that he's a murderer. Now we know she's dead, and we've learned that she was strangled. He may well be the strangler. He may not. I really don't know, and neither do any of your listeners or viewers. It was entirely possible that she wandered off and that he left in shame and fear. We don't know. We do know that he's disappeared. Now, did he disappear because he's guilty? Or did he disappear because he's afraid that no one will believe him? And is he himself despondent and suicidal? Is he even alive? You know, these are all questions that should be entertained based on the evidence that is available, but people want a satisfying narrative. And in the era of rage, especially in a murder case, I have a deep Freudian theory about this that you may not like. I think people love to hate accused murderers because we've got a little murder in all of our hearts. And we think, man, I've sat on my rage my whole life and I've never killed any of my enemies. I don't want him to get away with it because if he can get away with murder, that mocks my restraint. And so there's something diseased, something wrong with the public's fascination with high profile cases. I'm not saying that we should shut the courts and abandon the First Amendment. I think the more speech, the better. But every time I see a high profile case, I wince because I realize there's a snake oil salesman out there selling a story.
What you've just said reminds me of a quote by Alexander Solzhenitsyn. He wrote, "Gradually it was disclosed to me that the line separating good and evil passes not through states, nor between classes, nor between political parties either, but right through every human heart and through all human hearts. And even within hearts, overwhelmed by evil, one small bridgehead of good is retained." So go ahead.
Absolutely. I mean, Solzhenitsyn was absolutely brilliant. And I think he was right. There is a heart of darkness in the world, and it resides in every breast.
Now, as my final, I would be remiss not to ask, as my final question, so Alex Jones, he's reported the news for many years. Oftentimes, he's just reading straight from mainstream news. I would argue he went from controversial to these days, essentially a folk hero. You can look at his Joe Rogan numbers when you compare that to Elon Musk, et cetera. He's right up there with the biggest names on the planet today. So do you have any comments on Alex's legacy or anything that people should know?
Alex Jones is called a conspiracy theorist. And what is a conspiracy theorist? That's a person who concocts a narrative that many don't accept about what explains the world and how it works. I would tell you we're all conspiracy theorists. We all start as infants. Terrified by the world around us and dominated by our needs. As we evolve and mature, we become a little more sophisticated in our manipulation of the world. But I think we're all just scared infants beneath it all, and in the subconscious or the unconscious substrate over which our civilizations exist. We all grapple rather and grope. Grapple is a new word. You can all use it. You heard it here first. We all grapple and grope with dark fears. Alex addresses those. He does so in ways that are sometimes inflammatory and sometimes ways that people don't accept. But I think he should have and does have the right to speak freely. And the haters of Alex Jones are missing the same question they missed when Donald Trump was elected president. Not how did Trump get elected? Not why do people, why does Alex Jones say the things he said, but why are we attracted to people who make extreme statements? And I think it's because we long for what Augustine longed for. We longed for righteousness. And Augustine at least looked for it in the right places. We're looking in all the wrong places, getting all the wrong answers, and destroying the world in which we live.
I studied history in college, and I read dense texts on the Holocaust, for instance. And in college, I was learning about the how all of this happened. And I wanted to learn something more and how it all related to today. I guess the question was, did the Nuremberg trial solve all the problems that we saw then? And well, there was a lot of very useful thinkers. Alex Jones was one of them, who made the most sense in the context of what I was learning in history class. And I think that whereas in class, I learned the how from modern thinkers like Alex. I learned the whys, the whats, etc. And without those answers, you don't have a full picture of history. And I believe to oversimplify it, with history, we can look at it in two different lenses: a planned version of history, in which perhaps there is some planning for man, and then also a coincidental theory of history. And we're only taught the coincidental theory of history, that things are just kind of unfolding and there is no visible hand, if you will. And I think that we should at the very least be introduced to both theories.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
We've had the honor of sitting down today with Norm Pattis, one of America's leading lawyers. Norm, I know you are hard at work on a lot of important issues, so thank you for that. And thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It was a blast. I know I talked a lot, but I'm a lawyer. That's what I get paid to do.
And thank you everyone for listening. What's up, everyone? I hope you enjoyed the show. Head on over to GoldSilverBitcoin.com for more content like this, as well as long-form written articles about precious metals, Bitcoin, and other topics. Also, check out our shop where you can get precious metals, storable foods, and all sorts of other cool survival and prep gear as well.